There are thresholds in our lives that we only recognize in retrospect. They are not grand archways or ceremonial gates, but quiet, unassuming doorways we pass through without a second thought. For me, that threshold was the door to my roommate's bedroom, left perpetually ajar. It was an invitation I didn't understand, a question I was too afraid to ask, and the beginning of a silence that would eventually say more than words ever could. It started, as so many life-altering things do, with a simple, almost ridiculous request, born from the wreckage of a different kind of love. It was a Tuesday night, I think, when Julian finally asked me to stay. He stood in the frame of his door, a silhouette against the dim light within, looking like a ship that had lost its moorings. He didn't look at me, but at a fixed point on the hallway wall, as if mapping a course through treacherous waters. His voice, when it came, was low and sanded down by exhaustion. He said he slept better with noise, and then he asked if the noise could be me. It wasn't a sudden storm that wrecked him. It was a slow, quiet erosion. Julian and Sarah had been together for 2 years, a relationship that, from my vantage point in the adjacent room, seemed less like a passionate fire and more like a comfortable, well-tended hearth. But warmth can fade so gradually you don't notice the chill until you're shivering. Their end came not with a bang of slammed doors and shouted accusations, but with the quiet click of a key being placed on the kitchen counter and a whispered, "I think this is for the best." He walked back into our apartment that evening looking hollowed out, as if someone had reached inside him and scooped out all the essential parts, leaving only the shell. He was a software engineer, a man who built his life on logic, on the elegant certainty of code. If a system was broken, you found the bug, you wrote a patch, you fixed it. But there was no patch for this. This was the messy, unpredictable operating system of the human heart, and he was lost in its corrupted files. He didn't talk about it, not really. He mentioned it once, a flat, declarative statement delivered over a bowl of cereal the next morning. Sarah and I broke up, that was it. He offered no details, and I, knowing the architecture of his privacy, asked for none. I just nodded and said I was sorry, a wholly inadequate response for a pain I could see settling deep into his bones. In the days that followed, a strange, restless energy filled our shared space. He'd paced the length of the living room, from the window overlooking the street to the wall of my photographs, his socked feet making no sound on the worn hardwood. He would stand for long minutes, staring out at the city lights, his reflection a ghostly twin superimposed over the world outside. He was present in body, but his mind was elsewhere, running endless, frantic diagnostics on a system that had already crashed. He stopped sleeping. I could hear it through the wall. The sigh of his mattress as he shifted, the soft thud of his feet hitting the floor at 2 in the morning, the whisper of the refrigerator door opening and closing. The silence of his room, once his sanctuary, had become a void, and it was swallowing him whole. Our apartment had always been a place of comfortable quiet. We had coexisted for 3 years in a rhythm that suited us both. I, a photographer, cherished the stillness needed to lose myself in an edit, to see the world through the narrow frame of my lens. Julian, for all his surface-level sociability, needed a place to decompress, to shed the skin of his corporate life and exist without the need for performance. Our silence was a shared language, a comfortable blanket. But this new silence was different. It was thin and brittle, stretched taut with his unspoken grief and my unspoken concern. It was a hungry silence, full of empty spaces. I found myself lingering in the common areas, leaving my door open more often than not, a passive invitation for him to close the distance if he needed to. He began to take it, drifting into the living room while I sorted through contact sheets, settling onto the far end of the couch with his laptop, not speaking, just being. He was anchoring himself to my presence, using my quiet industry as a bulwark against his own chaotic inner world. The request, when it finally came, felt both shocking and inevitable. It was nearly midnight. I was cleaning my lenses at the kitchen table, the methodical, circular motions a form of meditation. He appeared in the doorway, a wraith in a gray t-shirt and sweatpants. His eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. "Can I ask you something weird?" he started, his gaze skittering away from mine. I stopped wiping the lens, giving him my full attention. "Anything." He took a deep breath, the sound of it raw and shaky. "When I was a kid," he began, his voice barely a murmur, I couldn't sleep without a fan on. Or the radio. Just some kind of background noise. The quiet is too loud right now. He finally looked at me, his expression a mixture of desperation and deep embarrassment. Would you mind just sitting in my room? For a little while? You could read, or work on your laptop, whatever. I think it would help. To not be so alone in there, my heart did a complicated, painful maneuver in my chest, a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. For years, I had carefully policed the boundaries between us, building walls around my feelings for him, treating our friendship like a fragile, priceless artifact that could be shattered by one wrong move. Loving Julian from a distance had become a part of my own internal architecture, a hidden room I never allowed anyone to enter. And here he was, fumbling with the lock, asking to be let in, without even knowing what he was asking. He was offering me a key to his most vulnerable space, and my first instinct was terror. Terror that I would be found out, that the quiet adoration I had harbored for so long would somehow become visible in the dim light of his desk lamp. But the terror was eclipsed by the profound, aching need in his eyes. He wasn't seeing me, not the me who had spent countless hours cataloging the exact shade of his eyes or the way his laugh crinkled their corners. He was seeing a friend, a steady presence, a human white noise machine. To say no would be a cruelty I was incapable of. To say yes felt like a betrayal of my own self-preservation. Of course, I said, and my voice was surprisingly steady. Yeah, of course, Julian. Relief washed over his face, so potent and immediate it was like watching a parched landscape drink in the first rain. The tension in his shoulders eased, and for the first time in a week, he looked a little less like a ghost. He gave me a small, grateful nod and retreated back into his room, leaving the door open a few inches, a silent summons. I gathered my book, my phone, and a glass of water, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind raced. I was walking into a minefield of my own creation. Every step would have to be measured, every breath controlled. I had to be nothing more than what he asked for, a sound in the quiet, a presence in the dark. I pushed open his door and slipped inside. He was already in bed, lying on his side, facing away from me. The only light came from a small lamp on his desk. I settled into the worn armchair in the corner, the one usually buried under a pile of clean laundry, and opened my book. The room smelled of him, a clean, subtle scent of his soap, his shampoo, and something uniquely Julian. It was an intimacy I was not prepared for. I didn't read a single word. I just sat there, listening to the sound of the pages turning in my hands and the sound of his breathing, waiting for it to deepen, to settle into the slow, even rhythm of sleep. And so the ritual began. It became our new, unspoken normal. Every night, around 11, I would gather my things and make the short pilgrimage from my room to his. Sometimes he would already be in bed, a quiet, "Hey," greeting me from the pillows. Other times he would be at his desk, finishing up some work, and we'd exchange a few tired words before he finally gave in to his exhaustion. I became a silent fixture in the corner of his world, an observer of his most unguarded moments. I learned the topography of his sleep, the way his right hand would often be tucked under his cheek, the slight frown that would cross his brow when a dream turned anxious, the soft, barely audible sigh he'd let out as he finally sank into deep slumber. I sat in that chair and edited photographs on my laptop, the muted glow of the screen illuminating my face. In a way, it felt fitting. I was doing what I always did, watching him through a frame, capturing moments of him that he would never see, cataloging details no one else would notice. The difference was that now, the distance was only a few feet. The air between us felt charged, thick with unspoken things. For him, I was a comfort, a simple solution to a simple problem. For me, it was a nightly exercise in exquisite torture. I had to build new walls, stronger ones, right there in his room. I constructed a persona of benign friendship, of casual, brotherly concern. I was the reliable roommate, the steady presence, the one who didn't ask questions. Inside, I was a seismograph, registering every tiny tremor. My awareness of him became hyperacute. I was conscious of the rise and fall of his chest, the rustle of his sheets, the temperature of the air circulating between us. My own body was a traitor, my heart rate accelerating when he'd shift towards me in his sleep, my breath catching when he'd murmur a name. Sometimes Sarah's, sometimes a name I didn't recognize from the depths of a dream. I was living a double life in that small, dimly lit room. On the outside, I was a still, calm pool. On the inside, a churning, chaotic ocean of longing and fear. I was terrified he would wake up one night, truly see me sitting there, and understand everything I was trying so desperately to hide. I was terrified he would see the way I watched him, the way my gaze softened when he was finally at peace, and that the fragile trust he had placed in me would evaporate. The first time the boundary blurred, it was because of a nightmare. I heard the sound first, a soft, distressed whimper. I looked up from my screen to see him thrashing, his body tangled in his comforter. His breathing was fast and shallow. My first instinct was to stay put, to remain the passive observer. That was my role. But then he cried out, a sharp, wounded sound that cut through the quiet and went straight into my heart. I couldn't just sit there. I put my laptop aside and crossed the room, my stockinged feet silent on the floorboards. I knelt by his bed, my own heart pounding in sympathy with his panic. "Julian," I whispered, my voice rough. He didn't respond, caught in the grip of whatever demons were chasing him through his subconscious. Hesitantly, I reached out and placed my hand on his shoulder. His skin was warm, damp with sweat. The effect was instantaneous. His body went still. The frantic motion ceased, and he let out a long, shuddering breath. He didn't wake, but he leaned into my touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement, seeking the anchor of it even in his sleep. I stayed there for a long time, kneeling on the floor, my hand resting on his shoulder, feeling the steady, calming rhythm of his heart under my palm. When I finally retreated to my chair, the air in the room had changed. A line had been crossed, a new level of intimacy established, and I knew, with a sinking feeling, that there was no going back. The escalation continued, a slow, incremental creep. A few weeks into our nightly ritual, he got sick. It was a nasty head cold that settled in his chest and left him weak and miserable. He spent the day on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, looking small and pathetic. That night, he was a wreck of congested coughs and feverish chills. When I came into his room, he was shivering despite being buried under 2 blankets. He looked at me with glassy, miserable eyes. "Stay," he rasped, his voice thick. I nodded, moving towards my chair. But he shook his head, a small, weak motion. He shifted over, creating a space on the mattress beside him, and patted the comforter. "It's so cold," he mumbled, a flimsy excuse that hung in the air between us. My entire nervous system went into high alert. This was a new threshold, a far more dangerous one. But looking at him, so utterly laid low, so clearly in need of simple human warmth, I couldn't refuse. I told myself it was medicinal. I was a human hot water bottle. Nothing more. I stretched out on top of the covers, a rigid, unmoving plank of a man, determined to maintain a clear physical boundary. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, every nerve ending screamingly aware of the man shivering a few inches away. After a few minutes, he turned onto his side, his back to me, and curled into a ball. The heat coming off his body was intense. Slowly, tentatively, the shivering subsided. He fell into a heavy, congested sleep, and I lay awake for hours, listening to him breathe, trapped between an impossible desire and a profound, protective tenderness. This was how we got here, to this place of charged silences and ambiguous intimacy. But to truly understand the weight of that room, the significance of my hand on his shoulder or my body lying stiffly beside his, you have to understand the foundation on which it was all built. You have to go back to the chlorine-scented air of a university natatorium, to the quiet camaraderie forged in the cold, dark hours before dawn. We met on the swim team in our freshman year of college. Julian was the star sprinter, a coiled spring of muscle and explosive energy. He moved with an easy, unthinking confidence that drew people to him like moths to a flame. He was all bright smiles and loud laughter on the pool deck. But in the water, he was a creature of focused, violent grace. His races were over in a blur of churning water and perfect form. I was his opposite in every way. A distant swimmer. My events were long, grueling affairs, battles of attrition against the clock and my own burning lungs. I was quiet, steady, and observant. My strength was not in explosive power, but in endurance, in the ability to find a rhythm and hold it for what felt like an eternity. We were two completely different types of athletes, two different types of people, yet we found a strange equilibrium in our shared exhaustion. Our friendship wasn't forged in the boisterous, celebratory moments after a successful meet. It was built in the quiet spaces in between. It was the shared, silent nod across the locker room after a brutal practice. It was sitting on the cold tile floor, too tired to move, sharing a protein bar without a word. It was the long, quiet drives to away meets, him at the wheel with the radio playing low, me in the passenger seat, watching the world slide by. He was surrounded by people, but I sensed a deep well of loneliness in him, a restlessness that his easy charm was designed to conceal. I think he sensed a corresponding stillness in me. He started seeking me out, not to talk, but for the absence of the need to talk. I became his quiet place. When the pressure of competing, of maintaining his grades, of living up to everyone's expectations became too much, he wouldn't go out with the team to blow off steam. He'd show up at my dorm room with a six-pack of cheap beer, and we'd just sit, sometimes for hours, the conversation sparse and unimportant. He was recharging, grounding himself in my lack of expectation. I didn't need him to be the star athlete or the life of the party. I just let him be. I can pinpoint the exact moment my quiet, platonic affection for him morphed into something deeper, something more dangerous. It was junior year, at a miserable, rainy mid-season meet. A freshman on our team, a kid named Mark, had a terrible race. He'd false started in his best event, a disqualification that cost our team crucial points. He was sitting on a bench at the far end of the pool deck, head in his hands, trying to hide the fact that he was crying. The coach yelled at him. His teammates either ignored him or offered clumsy, backslapping reassurances that only seemed to make it worse. But Julian, who had just won his own event in record time, walked over to him. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat down next to the kid, close enough that their shoulders were touching, and stared out at the water with him. After a long minute, he quietly started talking. I was too far away to hear the words, but I saw the gentle, earnest expression on his face. I saw him place a hand on the back of the kid's neck, a gesture of such profound, simple kindness. He wasn't performing. He wasn't being the team captain. He was just being decent. He was being gentle. And watching that small, quiet act of grace, something inside me cracked open. It was a terrifying, irreversible moment of clarity. I was in love with my best friend. I did what any sensible, terrified person would do. I took that fragile, newly born feeling and I buried it. I buried it deep, under layers of denial and pragmatism. Julian was straight. He dated women. Our friendship was the most stable, genuine connection in my life, and I would not risk it for a feeling he could never return. It would be a form of emotional vandalism, defacing something beautiful and rare. So, I became a curator of my own heart, carefully managing the exhibit. I learned to live with the quiet ache, the low-frequency hum of unrequited love. It became a part of my internal landscape, a secret garden I tended to in private but never showed to anyone, least of all him. I mastered the art of being the supportive friend. I listened to him talk about his dates, about his relationships, about Sarah. I offered neutral, helpful advice. I learned to smile and nod when every word was a tiny, sharp stone against my heart. It was a difficult, painful education, but I believed it was necessary. When we graduated, the idea of getting an apartment together seemed like the most natural thing in the world. For him, it was a practical matter of splitting rent with someone he knew he could live with. For me, it was a form of consensual torment, a way to keep him in my life at the cost of my own peace of mind. But the thought of not seeing him every day, of letting our easy intimacy fade into the occasional phone call and holiday text, was infinitely worse. So I agreed. I moved into the room at the end of the hall and settled into a life of proximity without possession. I learned the rhythm of his life outside the pool, the clink of his coffee mug in the morning, the sound of his keys in the lock in the evening, the low murmur of his voice on work calls. I photographed the way the morning light hit the scuff marks on the floor outside his bedroom door, the dust motes dancing in the air he had just passed through. My art became a secret vessel for my feelings, a way to capture the beauty I saw in his ordinary existence without ever having to confess it. Our apartment was my sanctuary and my prison, and the nightly ritual of sitting in his room was the culmination of it all, the most intimate and the most painful expression of our carefully misaligned friendship. I was closer to him than ever, and the distance between us had never felt so vast. And then came the night the silence broke. We had fallen into a pattern within the pattern. The nights I spent on top of his covers had become more frequent. The flimsy excuses had evaporated, replaced by a simple, quiet question from him. Will you stay? And I always would. On this particular night, the air was different. A storm was rolling in, the sky outside the window a bruised purple. The air in the room was heavy, charged with ozone and unspoken tension. We were lying side by side in the near dark, the only light a faint, silvery glow from the streetlights filtering through the blinds. We weren't touching, but I could feel the heat of his body across the small gulf between us. I could hear his breath, and I was sure he could hear mine. It wasn't the peaceful silence of our earlier nights. This was a loaded quiet, a silence humming with energy, filled with all the questions we had never asked and all the answers we were afraid to hear. It felt like the moment before a lightning strike, the world holding its breath. He shifted, turning onto his side to face me. I couldn't make out the details of his face in the gloom, only the dark shape of him against the slightly less dark room. My own body was rigid, every muscle tensed. I kept my eyes fixed on the ceiling, pretending to be on the edge of sleep, a lie my hammering heart was betraying with every beat. The silence stretched, pulling taut between us. I felt his gaze on me, and it was a physical weight. I waited for him to say something, to break the spell, to ask me if I was asleep, or to make a joke to dispel the intensity of the moment. But he just lay there, watching me, breathing in the same charged air. Leo. His voice was a ghost of a sound, a whisper that was almost indistinguishable from the sigh of the wind outside. It was so fragile, so tentative, it sent a tremor through me. I couldn't pretend to be asleep. I made a small sound in my throat, a hum of acknowledgement, unable to form a word. I still didn't look at him. I was a coward, hiding in the shadows of my own making. Another long, agonizing pause followed. I could feel him gathering himself, wrestling with a thought. The entire history of our friendship, of my secret love, of these strange, intimate nights, seemed to be compressed into that single, breathless moment. Would it be okay? 2 words. So simple, so devastatingly ambiguous. My mind fractured, racing down a dozen different corridors at once. Okay. Would what be okay? If I finally admitted that sitting in his room every night was both the best and worst part of my day? If I confessed that the smell of his laundry detergent on his pillows would be forever imprinted on my memory? If I told him that I had loved him, silently and patiently, for almost 5 years? I knew what he was asking. Of course I knew. The question had been hanging in the air between us for weeks, a palpable, shimmering thing. It was in every lingering glance, every shared silence, every night he asked me to stay. But hearing it spoken aloud, even in that broken whisper, made it real. It was a threshold, and he was asking for permission to cross it. The choice was mine. I could pretend not to understand. I could make a joke, deflect, and retreat to the safety of our established friendship. Or I could answer. I didn't use words. Words were inadequate. They were clumsy tools for something this delicate. Instead, I let my body speak the truth I had kept locked away for so long. I took a slow, deliberate breath, and I turned my head on the pillow. I finally met his gaze in the dark. And then I moved. I shifted my body, closing the final few inches between us, a slow, tectonic drift. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was a simple affirmation. An answer. It was my own question, asked in return. Is this what you mean? The air crackled. He didn't move for a second, and in that sliver of time, panic seized me. I had misread everything. I had made a catastrophic error. But then, he lifted a hand, his fingers hesitant as they brushed against my cheek. His touch was feather-light, a question in itself. And then he leaned in. The first kiss wasn't like anything I had ever imagined. My fantasies had always been cinematic, full of soaring music and dramatic revelations. The reality was quieter, softer, and infinitely more profound. It was hesitant and searching, his lips barely brushing against mine. It was a question, not a statement. It was clumsy, our noses bumping, a moment of awkwardness that was so real, so us, it made my heart ache. It tasted of uncertainty and the faint, metallic tang of fear. But underneath it all, there was a current of rightness, a deep, resonant feeling of coming home. It was a confession, offered and accepted in the dark. It was the sound of a lock, rusted shut for years, finally, gently, turning. The storm broke outside, and the first drops of rain began to patter against the window pane. A soft percussion for the moment the world shifted on its axis. We stayed like that for a long time, the kiss deepening almost imperceptibly, a slow, tender exploration in the quiet of the storm. It wasn't about passion, not yet. It was about recognition. It was about seeing and being seen, finally, after years of hiding in plain sight. The morning after was a study in silence, but it was a new, terrible kind. The charged, intimate quiet of the night before had been replaced by a brittle, awkward stillness. I woke up first, to the gray light of a rainy dawn. Julian was still asleep, his back to me, a continent of sheets separating us. I slipped out of his bed as quietly as I could, my movements furtive, like a thief. I retreated to my room and closed the door, the soft click echoing the sound of a cage door swinging shut. When I emerged an hour later, he was in the kitchen, already dressed for work. He was making coffee, his back to me, his shoulders set in a rigid, defensive line. "Morning," he said, without turning around. His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. The easy warmth that had always defined our mornings was gone, replaced by a formal, chilling politeness. He poured his coffee into a travel mug, added a splash of milk, and was out the door with a clipped, "See you later," before I could even form a response. He had built a wall between us overnight, and it was made of silence. The next week was the longest of my life. Julian became a phantom in our apartment. He left before I woke up and came home long after I had retreated to my room. He was avoiding me with a surgical precision that was both impressive and devastating. The ritual was broken. His bedroom door remained firmly, unequivocally closed. The silence he had once begged me to fill now became his shield, his weapon. I was adrift. The brief, beautiful moment of connection we had shared now felt like a hallucination, a dream I had cruelly mistaken for reality. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, analyzing it from every angle, searching for the moment I had misinterpreted the data. Had I imagined the tenderness? The reciprocity? Had he just been lonely and confused, reaching for the nearest warm body, and I had foolishly imbued it with a meaning it never had? My heart, which had felt so full and open for one brief night, was now a hollow, aching cavern. The pain of it was worse than the years of silent longing, because now I knew what I was missing. I had tasted it. The loss of our friendship felt like the true tragedy. The risk I had so carefully avoided for years had been taken, and the fallout was exactly what I had always feared. I had lost my best friend. I let it go on for 6 days. 6 days of living with a ghost, of strained silence and the palpable weight of his avoidance. 6 days of my own hope curdling into a bitter mixture of hurt and anger. I couldn't live like this, in the ruins of what we'd been, haunted by what we'd almost become. The silence had to be broken, even if it meant shattering the last, fragile remnants of our connection. I was done waiting. I was done being a passive observer. That night, I waited for him in the living room, the lights off, sitting in the dark like a sentinel. I heard his key in the lock just after 10. He stepped inside, and I saw his body jolt when he saw my silhouette on the couch. He was hoping I'd be asleep. He started to move past me, a mumbled greeting on his lips, heading for the safety of his room. I couldn't let him. "Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the darkness. It was stronger than I expected. "We need to talk." He stopped, his back still to me. "I'm really tired, Leo. Can it wait?" "No," I said, standing up. The anger I had been suppressing was finally bubbling to the surface. It wasn't a hot, raging anger, but a cold, steady fury born of deep hurt. "No, it can't wait. Don't do this. Don't pretend that nothing happened. Don't treat me like a stranger in our own home." He still wouldn't turn around. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "You kissed me," I said, the words stark and undeniable in the quiet room. "And now you can't even look at me. You owe me more than that. I deserve more than that." That finally made him turn. His face, illuminated by the sliver of light from the hallway, was a mask of conflict. He looked exhausted and cornered. "I don't know what you want me to say," he said, his voice low and strained. "I want you to say anything." I shot back, my voice rising. "I want you to be honest. If it was a mistake, then say it was a mistake. If you regret it, then have the decency to tell me. But this silence, this disappearing act, it's cowardly, Julian. And it's cruel. My words hit their mark. I saw him flinch as if I had physically struck him. The fight went out of him, and he slumped back against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty or hostile. It was heavy with impending truth. When he finally spoke, his voice was muffled by his hands, thick with a shame and confusion that was painful to hear. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "You're right. I'm sorry." He looked up at me, and his eyes were glistening. "I'm scared, Leo. That's the truth. I've never felt that way. For a guy? It's never happened." He took a ragged breath. "And when I kissed you, it didn't feel wrong. It felt right. It felt more right than anything has in a very long time. And that terrifies me. I don't know what it means. I don't know who I am anymore." He confessed that his immediate reaction the next morning was panic. A deep, primal panic that made him want to run, to erase it, to pretend it had never happened. He thought if he could just ignore it, if he could just put enough distance between us, the feeling would fade, and we could go back to the way things were. He was so terrified of losing our friendship, of what this would change, that he had ended up doing the one thing guaranteed to destroy it. He wasn't rejecting me. He was rejecting a part of himself he had never known existed. He was looking at the wreckage of his own identity, and he was lost. Listening to him, watching him break down on the hallway floor, the cold anger in my chest dissolved, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. All the hurt, all the feelings of foolishness, they evaporated. I wasn't looking at the man who had broken my heart. I was looking at my best friend, who was scared and alone and wrestling with something that had shaken him to his core. I was seeing the unknowing initiator for who he truly was. Not a careless player, but someone just as frightened of vulnerability as I had always been. My years of hiding had been a choice, a form of self-protection. His was a panicked, reflexive reaction to having his entire world turned upside down. In that moment, the power dynamic between us, the one where I was the pining, silent observer, and he was the oblivious object of affection, it leveled out. We were just two people, lost in the dark, trying to find our way. I crossed the space between us and sat on the floor opposite him, our knees almost touching. "Okay," I said, my voice soft now. "Okay, you're scared. I get it. It's a lot." He wouldn't meet my eyes, staring at the floorboards between us. "You don't have to have it figured out, Julian," I continued. "We don't have to put a label on it. We don't have to know what it means for the rest of our lives. We just have to start with right now. We can start with being honest. We can be scared together." He finally looked up at me, his eyes wide with a fragile, tentative hope. "You're not mad?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I managed a small, sad smile. I was hurt, but I'm not mad anymore. How can I be mad at you for being scared? I've been scared of this for years. The admission slipped out before I could stop it. A truth I had guarded for so long, now offered up in the dim light of our hallway. His eyes searched mine, and I could see him recalibrating our entire history in his mind, seeing past moments in a new light. He didn't say anything. He just nodded, a slow, dawning understanding on his face. We didn't talk much more that night. The emotional exhaustion was too great. We eventually picked ourselves up off the floor and said a quiet goodnight. I went to my room, my door closing with a soft click, and I fully expected that to be the end of it for the night. I thought we had agreed to a ceasefire, a period of quiet reflection. But about 20 minutes later, there was a soft knock on my door. I opened it to find Julian standing there, looking just as lost and uncertain as he had on the floor. He didn't say anything. It was a role reversal, a mirror image of all those nights he had stood in his own doorway. He was waiting for an invitation. I understood. This wasn't about him needing noise to sleep anymore. This was about him needing not to be alone with his own confusion. This was about presence. Without a word, I stepped back and opened my door wider. He walked past me into my room, a space he had so rarely entered, and hesitated in the center of it, looking around at the stacks of photo books and the prints pinned to the walls. He looked at my unmade bed. Then he looked at me. I closed the door behind us and walked over to my bed, pulling back the covers on one side. I lay down, and then I waited. He watched me for a long moment. then crossed the room and lay down beside me, on top of the covers, just as I had done in his room all those weeks ago. We lay in the dark, not speaking, not touching, just breathing. After a long time, I felt him shift, and then his hand found mine in the space between us. His fingers laced through mine, his grip firm and sure. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a statement. It was an anchor. And for the first time in a week, I felt like I could breathe again. The weeks that followed were a process of learning a new language. It was a language spoken not in grand declarations, but in small, quiet gestures. It was the way he started making enough coffee for both of us in the morning, leaving a mug on the counter for me. It was the way his arm would intentionally brush against mine when we were standing at the kitchen sink. It was the way we started watching movies on the couch again, and how, after an hour, his head would inevitably find its way to my shoulder, a gesture of trust that felt more significant than any kiss. We were rebuilding, not on the old foundation of our platonic friendship, but on this new, more honest ground. It was slow and tentative. We were two people learning how to walk again after a long illness. There were stumbles. There were moments of awkwardness and uncertainty, moments where the old patterns of distance would try to reassert themselves. But we would always find our way back to each other, usually with a simple, grounding touch, a hand on the arm, a reassuring squeeze of the shoulder. We were mapping a new territory, and we were doing it together. The nights became our sanctuary. He never went back to sleeping alone. Sometimes he would come to my room. Sometimes I would go to his. There was no more pretext, no more performance. The need was simple and mutual. We needed to be near each other as we navigated the quiet, uncertain hours of the night. We talked more. He told me about the suffocating pressure he'd always felt to be the person everyone expected him to be, the confident athlete, the successful engineer, the straight man with the pretty girlfriend. He was realizing that he'd been living a life based on a blueprint someone else had drawn. Being with me, he said, felt like the first thing he had ever chosen for himself, without any external expectation. And I, in turn, told him about the years of quiet observation, of the hidden room in my heart where I had kept my feelings for him under lock and key. I told him how his kindness had been the thing that first broke through my defenses. We were trading secrets in the dark, offering up our most vulnerable pieces and finding they fit together perfectly. One night, about a month after our hallway confrontation, we were lying in his bed. The storm of our conflict had long passed, leaving behind a clean, quiet peace. I was on the verge of sleep, my head on his chest, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my ear. It was the most comforting sound in the world. He stirred, his hand coming up to stroke my hair. "Leo," he murmured into the quiet. I hummed in response, too comfortable to speak. "Thank you," he said. I shifted so I could see his face in the dim light. "For what?" He smiled, a soft, gentle curve of his lips. "For waiting," he said. "For not giving up on me when I was being an idiot. For sitting in that stupid chair," I smiled back. "It's a very comfortable chair," he laughed, a low, warm sound that vibrated through his chest. "I think I'm falling in love with you," he said, his voice suddenly serious. The words were simple, unadorned, and they landed in my heart with the weight of absolute truth. I didn't need to say it back. He already knew. He had known, I think, for a very long time, even before I did. I just leaned in and kissed him, a kiss that was no longer hesitant or questioning, but full of a quiet, certain joy. Later that night, I woke for some reason. The room was still and dark. Julian was sound asleep beside me, his breathing deep and even. I started to get out of bed to get a glass of water, my movements slow so as not to wake him. As my feet touched the floor, I noticed something. His bedroom door, which for years had been the great symbol of our ambiguous state, left ajar as a tentative invitation, was closed. I didn't remember either of us closing it. I looked back at the bed. Julian had shifted in his sleep, and his arm was stretched out across the space where I had been lying, as if searching for me. I realized then that he must have closed it before we fell asleep. It was a small, unconscious act, perhaps, but it felt monumental. It was a final, definitive statement. He wasn't leaving the door open for escape anymore. He wasn't hedging his bets. He was closing it, shutting out the rest of the world, and keeping us safe inside. I slipped back into bed, curling up against his warmth, and laid my hand over his. He stirred, his fingers instinctively tightening around mine. We no longer needed the noise. We had found a better kind of quiet, one built not on absence, but on the profound and reassuring presence of each other. We had stopped being two separate people coexisting in the same space, and had finally, blessedly, begun to build a home, right there in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together.